Thank you. Thanks for having me here. Hope I can leave you with something useful. It's quite a targeted presentation. There's really only one topic I want to dive into here. So just so you know, in case you don't already know, Austroads is an association of members who are responsible for the roads around Australia and New Zealand. Transport for New South Wales is one of our members, as are the Commonwealth and the Association of Local Governments. And our purpose, when we were set up 91 years ago, was to support the efforts of the states and territories of Australia to harmonise their driver licensing and road practices. So that's what we're still on about, and we produce guidance that's used around Australia and New Zealand that is providing good outcomes. So guidance on everything from road pavements and maintenance and planning a road to road safety and road design. So today I've been asked to talk to you about perceptual countermeasures for motorcyclists. So I'll give you a little bit of background on what they are and then share some results from some work we've done recently. So perceptual countermeasures are something you apply to the road or the road network or the road or the environment around the road. They're low cost, they're non-obtrusive, they often comprise road markings or roadside furniture. And the purpose of these is to reduce travel speed or influence the vehicle's path. And they're intentionally designed to influence your speed perception as a driver, to influence your mental workload, potentially increasing mental workload, or increasing your perception of risk, or make you feel a bit uncomfortable. So the bottom left example there is an urban setting in Singapore. These sort of things are seen all over the place, but in particular it's a painted treatment that just makes things look a little bit more, well, what's going on here? Why are they raised, or what's happening? So it's subtle. The driver's not having to think too much, but it's just providing a bit of a cue. And on the right-hand side, you've got guideposts that are gradually increasing in size. So it changes your perception about the speed you're coming into a curve at. Now, what about for motorbike riders or for motorcyclists? We know that curves, we've seen that mentioned quite a few times today, curves are a real danger zone for motorcyclists, with probably around 15 to 20% of motorcycle death and serious injury occurs on curves, often involving a loss of control and running off the road or into an oncoming vehicle. So perceptual countermeasures have been getting quite a bit of attention lately for their potential to improve the motorcyclist line through a curve. We really want to avoid the motorcyclist getting the wrong curve and then crossing over into the oncoming traffic and then having to make an emergency manoeuvre and potentially losing control. So the image here is an example from Europe where we're basically saying, motorcyclists, please keep out of the orange zone. So that's one example. There's more and more coming. It's really about trying to help the motorcyclist position and then give them a bit of a cue about the speed as well. The Road Safety Task Force, which is an Austroads group and comprises 11 representatives from our member base, including Bernard. They saw this issue as a relevant one for all the states and territories to come together and share. So it's a collective problem and a collective opportunity rather. So we wanted to build the evidence base. So I've mentioned that these perceptual countermeasures are gaining in popularity, but it's still early days and we don't have a lot of evidence. So we had already had a trial done in Victoria and there was also one in New Zealand. We wanted to build the evidence base. And so we had an opportunity to do some evaluation because Queensland had found a bit of money to trial a couple of treatments. So here I'd like to acknowledge Mario Mongiardini, Matt Baldock, Christopher Stokes, and from Uni of Adelaide, Centre for Automotive Safety Research, and Hannah Tan of Safety System Solutions. So these people led the project that Austroads commissioned, and our members supported them with that work. We set up a project back in 2019. We published a report on that last year. 2023. And I'm just going to take you through that project. I'll move fairly quickly. So we started with a literature review, which is what we'll often do at Austroads. We looked overseas for examples of, are you okay if I just call them PCMs? Perceptual countermeasures. So we looked overseas for examples. We saw there's quite a lot of action in Europe, and some more evaluations were coming. So we had a sense of what was being done. Particularly Luxembourg has at least 50 of these treatments, Austria, Slovenia, Spain, and evaluations were coming out. Not many though, so we did recognise the value in our work. There are 5 general types of PCMs, so speed correction, line navigation, line correction. You might combine those and you might have general guidance. So speed correction PCMs really just trying to get the driver a message that you're going fast, you're going to have to slow down. We see these a lot more for regular motor vehicles, not motorcycles. You might have vehicle activated warning signs saying slow down. It might detect your speed dynamically. The speed advisory signs, warning signs, painted coloured edge lines. So I'm supposed to flick over here, I think. The hash marks on the left, obviously the faster you're going, the more they're whizzing by, and that's playing with your in your peripheral vision and giving you a subtle cue. Line navigation is the basic stuff. Humans are very good at following lines, and so they've long been a staple of road design. Reflector guideposts are a part of that. Line correction. Now this is where we're getting really interested in the motorcycle space. This is where we try to push a driver or rider a little bit in a particular direction. So you can have line marking on the periphery or transverse, so in the centre of the lane. There's just a few examples there. Was it Luxembourg, Germany, and New Zealand on the right there. There were examples where the peripheral line markings and the line correction was being associated with the speed correction. We like the look of this one. So you've got a combination of peripheral markings and ascending guideposts. Another area is just general guidance. This is where you get things like chevron alignment markers. So just in conclusion from that literature review, there is very few motorcycle-specific PCMs that have been studied. What we had observed in those studies was a modest reduction on travel speed, or a modest effect at least, and some of the PCMs that have been studied have resulted in a movement in lane position, and obviously that further studies were required. So the next step was to conduct a workshop with our members, including some motorcyclists, and we just put a whole lot of options on the table. I'm going to skip quickly here. We heard a lot about what we should be avoiding, and some ideas might seem good on paper, but not be suitable for a motorcycle rider. So some of the things we needed to avoid: multiple colours. Well, this is a maintenance issue. It just adds complexity. It may even incite undesired speed behaviour. Checkered flag patterns. We don't want to make our roads look like a racetrack, so that was dispensed with. Lane width PCMs. So that's a measure that goes right across the lane. That may be perceived as a hazard, even if it isn't. It might be perceived that way. So that was discounted. In terms of a trajectory in position, we didn't want to impose, you must follow this exact line. So we didn't want to make a really narrow line on the road. So you have to follow this track. We recognise that motorcyclists they may have their own preferred style, and it might be for their type of bike. It might require a slightly different line than another bike. And then the bottom ones, you can add complexity, add technological sort of things. We didn't want to make anything complex. This was a trial, so maintenance and cost were important considerations. So we shortlisted 3 options that you can see in the photos here. And then we've basically arrived at a peripheral transverse line marking option. There was a standard design that had already been trialled in Victoria. We ended up modifying that design a little bit. So around the curve, we're only talking here about right-hand curves. So we're riding on the left lane in Australia, we're turning right. This is where we had the most concern about motorcyclists encroaching into the oncoming traffic. We wanted to steer them away from that line. So at the apex of the curve, the lines are getting longer. They're encroaching further into the lane. So they're narrowing up your corridor of black at the apex, and then they diminish again as you move away from the apex. Okay, so we conducted a trial. We've installed the perceptual countermeasures at 2 sites. Now we've had a site that's got a fairly tight curve, and then another site that's got a fairly shallow curve. One's a 60k zone, one is a 100. So we've identified a suitable route. It had to be close enough to Brisbane so we could get to it. It had to be popular with motorcyclists. It needed to have a crash history. And the particular crashes we were interested in here were the run-off road at Curve and the head-on crash at Curve. So that took us to these sites here. I mentioned the 60k zone, the tight curve on the left, and then the next one along is a shallow curve, the 60k and the 100k zones. And after implementation, this is what the treated sites look like. And I should have just mentioned the previous, you can see control sites as well. So we found 2 similar sites in the sharp curve and then 2 in a shallow curve, and we treated just one of them. So we had a comparison. You do see here a side benefit of the PCM, of this particular PCM at least, with that white paint at night. So you're improving delineation, which is going to be helpful for all road users. So then we needed to collect some data. We collected data for a 4-week period before doing anything. Then we installed the treatments. It was paint in this case, and waited a couple of weeks. And then we observed for 4 weeks. So to collect data, there was a radar collecting speed measurements at the apex of the curve only. There was a camera observing lane position at the entry to the curve and at the apex. And then there was also vehicle classification data collection. So after the fact, someone would observe the video recording and classify the vehicle. We did classify into 3 motorbike types, as you can see there. You've got the sports, the touring, and the cruiser. The middle picture at the bottom there shows that we virtually segmented the road or the lane into 6 segments, so we could categorise where the motorcyclist was tracking. What we observed in terms of the vehicles that were travelling through, motorcyclists represented about 20 to 25% of the traffic, and that was consistent in both the before and after periods. We also timed this to coincide with the dry period in southern Queensland, so we're not going to get any. We're trying to minimise weather effects. Most of the traffic was observed on weekends, which is what you'd expect on a popular motorcycle route. Okay, so I'm going to share some results. Speed behaviour, we did see a modest reduction in speed of a few k's an hour in each category. You notice that the speed reduction occurred at the treated sites, but not at the control sites. With one exception, sport bikes on the tight curve. But you would notice also that the speeds that are observed are all below, well, the average speeds are below the speed limit. I should say, in terms of the site itself, we didn't advertise that we were doing the study. We wanted it to be as natural as possible. Obviously, there were cameras set up. They didn't look like enforcement cameras, and they were sitting at both the control and the treatment site. So maybe that contributed to the general speed compliance of the sites across all vehicle types. But it does give us some confidence that there is a genuine speed effect. So the main purpose of the PCM we used was to shift the trajectory and get riders away from that centre line. So at our treated sites, we did see quite a big shift away from the centre line at the apex and a small shift at the curve entry. We're also seeing a tighter distribution. So I might just give you a moment to try and figure out what you're looking at there. So at the right-hand side of each of those charts, you've got the number of, well, that's the segment closest to the centre line. So before the paint was going in, we were having more riders in that segment closest to the centre line. Afterwards, there was a big shift. But you're also seeing generally all the riders going in a more restricted envelope. So that's a good thing. We didn't measure trajectory, so we didn't measure the exact path of every motorcycle. We just got them at the entry point and the apex. But those results are indicative that the trajectory was the sort of thing we're teaching. Where you're... I'll leave someone else to talk about that. Maybe Duncan can fill us in. This table here summarises the proportion of motorcyclists riding in each lane segment. So again, there's that considerable reduction riding in position 6 up against the centre line, and an increase in positions 4 and 5, which is kind of what we want. And after the treatment, the most basic point, most motorcyclists are choosing to ride away from the centre line. We saw a minor reduction in speed. It's consistent with other trials that we'd observed in the literature review. However, we did see that some of the trials that had a long after period of observation did notice that the reduction in speed wasn't necessarily maintained. So we do think there's a novelty effect that may diminish. Now, in terms of lane position, there was a negligible difference at the curve entry. Also, these results are consistent with other research, and there is also a benefit for other vehicle types. Okay, here's the trajectory I was trying to describe better with a picture. So again, while we didn't measure the exact trajectory, what we have seen is consistent with a trajectory that aligns with what we're teaching riders. So that's enter wide, drift to centre, and exit tight. There are obvious limitations with the treatment and the research. We do expect the cameras will have introduced some bias. Our cameras look different to enforcement cameras, as I mentioned earlier. We're optimistic there will be a long-term effect for the PCM, for the lane movement, which has been observed in there's a very similar trial in Austria, which measured for 3 years quite a similar treatment, and they were finding the results were persisting. There were concerns raised. The line marking being slippery. We did not use a high friction paint. The logic there was if this was a failure, we wanted to just get rid of it real quick. So, and also another part of the logic is if motorcyclists choose not to ride on the paint, that's actually a good thing. We don't want them in this zone. So if there's a perception of slipperiness, that might work in our favour. The sites in Queensland are now been in place for 3.5 years, and we've had no concerns raised. The paint's obviously fading a bit, but it's still there. Although we haven't gone out with our cameras to watch exactly what's happening. But it is good, we haven't had concerns raised. Riding in the centre of lane is discouraged. That might be the zone where you might find debris or oil. So there was some concern raised that in this case we're actually pushing riders through that centre. But when you're observing the motorcyclists without the lines painted, they're still doing that. They are riding through the centre. It's kind of necessary to take the best trajectory. There are some additional effects that we think are important to consider. There's some potential additional safety benefits, not why we did it, but good to know. We can see the curve better, especially at night time or in low light conditions. There's an alternative reference when negotiating a curve. So this helps all drivers. This wasn't the purpose, but the lane, the perceptual measure on the left-hand side of the lane also helped, as I said, we tightened up the distribution. So we were moving motorcyclists away from the edge, which is a good thing. So there's less gravel and potentially damage to the road there. Some of the other questions, we might induce drivers to drift towards the roadside on shallow curves. We weren't seeing that. Visual clutter effect. These are just things that are possible issues that we might need to keep our eyes on. Inducing cyclists to drift towards the lane centre. And there was also a concern about interfering with vehicle safety technology that is reading the lines. So really quickly, in conclusion, PCMs appear capable of influencing riders' lane position at the apex. If we wanted to work harder to help motorcyclists get into the best position at the entry, we might consider the gating. This might be where you put some kind of arrow where you'd like the motorcyclist to go. There was a New Zealand example I showed earlier where they've done that. So you may look to put those two things together. That moderate speed calming effect. Just a word of caution about these treatments. We don't think they should be used as a blanket treatment. You wouldn't apply this on every curve, but it's something you would reserve for the critical curves where you've really got to help. So you don't want motorcyclists to rely on it, but also to lose faith with motorcyclists. You are trying to highlight where they might need a bit more assistance. Some really good news. The CASA, the Centre for Automotive Safety Research, so the same people who worked with us, have now won a grant from the Commonwealth Government to basically redo this work at a greater scale. So there's 8 sites that will be trialled in Victoria, Queensland and Tasmania, and evaluated. And the evaluation will be a little more thorough, so they'll be looking at things like the trajectory. So that's looking to install the treatments in late 2025, and we should have some results out in early 2027. So Austroads is going to be partnering with the research team on this one and making sure that what we learn gets into Austroads guidance. That's kind of the point, so that we more rapidly see deployment of good opportunities. So a final word is that PCMs can be used to good effect to reduce speeds and improve trajectory, or both. You can get more details here. You can hear the real experts speaking about it. So thank you.